now it's my pleasure to introduce our workshop leaders. So we're really pleased that to have two people here from the Atlantic States Legal Foundation out of Syracuse, New York. So the Atlantic States Legal Foundation is a nonprofit organization that works with a lot of environmental work. So they provide technical, legal, and organizing services to a variety of citizen groups, local governments, and others on a wide variety of environmental issues. So their work includes sustainable urban landscapes, water resources, forestry, and agroforestry. So today our workshop presenters include Paul Harris, who is the program director at ASLF. And Paul has an MS in landscape architecture from SUNY ESF and is working on a second master's in agroforestry and natural resources management from the University of Missouri. So he is joined by Dylan Siever, who is the executive director of ASLF, and Dylan has an MPS in environmental policy from SUNY ESF. So welcome to our speakers.
Thank you, Kristen, very much for the intro. And if you guys are ready for the information on the jumping room. So that was a great introduction. We're Atlantic States Legal Foundation, and Kristen just told you our mission and what we do in a nutshell, so I don't have to do that part. But just to go over quickly in bullet form what we do, we're an environmental nonprofit in Syracuse. And our big claim to fame is actually initiating the cleanup of Onondaga Lake in Syracuse back in 1982. And we actually brought a lawsuit against Onondaga County for their violation of the Clean Water Act. And what that did was sort of refocus everyone's attention onto the lake. And soon after that, Honeywell was had their lawsuit brought against them by EPA and DEC. And the rest is history. There's been a tremendous, I'm sure a lot of you are aware of the cleanup efforts, been a tremendous and long, decades-long effort to restore Onondaga Lake. And going back to that initial lawsuit from 1980, actually the lawsuits from 1988, we were founded in 1982. So that's our history, and that's actually explains our name. The name sometimes throws people off. We don't necessarily just operate in the Atlantic States. We're not really a legal foundation, but that's kind of the joke. We have people approach us sometimes thinking that we're a law clinic or that we are a grant making foundation. And our name is sort of, it's kind of an inside joke at this point. And we often go by ASLF. So the branding issue is something we're very aware of.
What is your region that you?
Well, based on our past work, we've done actually work internationally. I'd say recently, in recent years, we've really only focused on Central New York. We've done projects all around the country. Most of them of those projects have been litigation. We have a long history of litigation. I think we've brought over 1,000 lawsuits going back to the late 80s, but we don't really do litigation anymore. And almost all that litigation has been against polluters. Usually in violation of the Clean Water Act or the Clean Air Act. So back in the day, we did have attorneys on staff, hence the name Legal Foundation, but we've evolved into really more of a implementation and technical assistance provider related to a lot of the projects that we used to do, which is interesting. So today we're focused on agroforestry, urban forestry, green infrastructure, other water quality restoration projects. And you can see an example here in the image of one of our rain gardens. This is actually one of 4 rain gardens that we own in Syracuse, going back to a Green Innovation Grant that we received in 2015. And we have also been involved in other green infrastructure projects like Save the Rain in Syracuse. If you're not aware of what Save the Rain is, this was the county's project to basically use green infrastructure to mitigate stormwater. So going back to our lawsuit, we had to amend it in 2006, I believe, to make it so that the county was required to make 6% of the capture accomplished through green infrastructure. So all the rain gardens in Syracuse, the bioswales, the tree trenches are going towards that goal. Our rain gardens here, this is one of 4. This is technically not part of their capture requirement, but we We just did it because we are trying to promote green infrastructure, and we figured these would be good demonstration projects for the community. And this is on a vacant lot, by the way. So that's what we do. We've pretty much morphed into an implementation and technical assistance provider related to forestry and green infrastructure. So we are here today. This is the second workshop in a series funded by the New York State Department of Health. And the funding is actually coming from COVID relief money. So what they have done is funded a series of wellness workshops. And I think there's over 100 recipients of this grant all throughout the state. And the idea is to build community health in a very broad sense. So we are technically required to make you aware of that. And we also have free COVID tests here in the front of the room in this box. Please help yourself to as many as you want. You may notice that they are expired, but we were assured by the Department of Health that they still work. We also have up front elderberry lozenges, which you're welcome to sample, help yourself if you want to try one of those. And if you haven't had a chance, we have a sign-in sheet. We just ask that maybe after the presentation, you just sign in so we have a good idea who attended today. I would say that the main purpose of our workshop series is right here to address social determinants of health through wellness outreach and COVID-19 health literacy in Oswego County. And we will be doing 9 events total. This is the second one. We have a number of partners and collaborators on this project. SUNY Oswego and Rice Creek Field Station are 2 of them. Thank you very much for having us here today and inviting us to come celebrate Arbor Day. We have a number of other ones in Fulton and also in Pulaski. We're working with the Garden Club, the Block Builders, and the City of Fulton Parks and Rec. And we had our first workshop actually in Fulton. And our next one is going to be in Pulaski. Here's the schedule. So this schedule is mostly set. I would say towards the end, it's a little bit TBD. But as you can see, we have a number of additional events in this series, and they are open to the public. You're welcome to attend any of them. Several of them are going to be sit-down workshops like this, and it would be the same presentation you're going to see today or similar. But a few of them are going to be tabling events and also tree planting in Fulton. Specifically on May 17th, we're going to be working with Fulton Garden Club and the city and a lot of 8th graders to do a big cleanup of the North Bay campground and also plant some trees and a small food forest and garden. We are going to be announcing all of these events on our social media, so please, ASLF 1982 is our Facebook and Instagram if you don't already follow us. And you can also go to our website, aslf.org. And if for some reason you don't write it down or you forget, I'm sure you can get in touch with Kristen and she can give you our information if you need to later. So jumping into the content here, we're going to start by just talking about some of the bigger themes and related to why we're here. And then we're going to shift and talk about agroforestry and how that relates to wellness and the health benefits we get from our environment. So this is a wellness grant series, and I think, how do we define wellness? So I actually like this definition up here. There are numerous definitions, but generally it's a state of physical, mental, social, and emotional well-being, and importantly, more than just the absence of disease. Something to keep in mind. There are a lot of factors that contribute to wellness or can detract from wellness, and here's a list here, and I put stress on the top of the list because I think that's one that gets underestimated very much, and we don't talk about it enough. Chronic stress and the impacts of that on long-term health outcomes, specifically chronic disease, and also communicable disease outcomes as in regards to our immune system and how resilient we are, for example, in the face of pandemics. But also, a lot of these, I'm sure, are not surprising to see. Diet and exercise, mental health contributes as well, family and social life, other determinants as well, like your economic state can also be a factor that has an impact on wellness. So just keep that in mind as we talk about some of the content and topics that we're discussing today related to agroforestry and Greenspace. So just diving a little bit into the environmental psychology, we're operating with this concept of nearby nature. And this was innovated by the Kaplans, who are researchers at the University of Michigan in the 80s and 90s. They did a lot of work on environmental psychology and the benefits of what they call nearby nature. And it's outlined very well in the experience of nature covered in this book in a way that I think is very interesting to read. Even if you are not into reading academic stuff, I still think this book is quite interesting and you can enjoy it, so I recommend it. But basically, they make this argument based on evidence, and since this book was written in the 90s, there has been a lot more evidence also produced to support this argument that nearby nature is something that everybody should have access to, and because it has health benefits. And it doesn't have to be like a national park or a wilderness area. It can be something as small as park, your backyard, a garden, trees planted in urban areas, small pocket parks, urban forests, college campuses, etc. They also came up with something called art attention restoration theory. And this is sort of the operative mechanism here. So nature has the ability to restore and replenish concentration, focus, cognition, and can actually cure mental fatigue. And there is evidence that they come up with and they put together and compile in their argument to support this. So we can almost say that exposure to nearby nature is a treatment for stress and anxiety. And that's something to keep in mind. I think everywhere, also on college campuses, I came across a study that came out just this year, actually indicating that Gen Z has a kind of like 60% anxiety rate, chronic anxiety rate, quite possibly making Gen Z the most anxious generation we've ever seen. Something to keep in mind because nearby nature can help treat that, in a toolbox with many other tools. Something to keep in mind for college campuses as well. So with that theoretical framework in mind, we can jump into our discussion of agroforestry and how and really make some connections here between agroforestry and wellness, environmental psychology, etc. So agroforestry is something that a lot of people haven't really heard of, but it's characterized as one of the most newest ancient practices, meaning that it's new in the sense that within the past several decades, maybe since like starting in the 80s and 90s, it's been brought to the table a lot more often in academia, as well as in the agricultural and agronomic sector. But it's ancient in the sense that it was probably practiced even before agriculture itself, even before the advent of domesticating grains. I would even make the argument that agroforestry was probably practiced going back into the Paleolithic in a more simple sort of way. And if I were to characterize agroforestry in like just one simple concept, I would say it's agriculture that involves trees. There are many ways to define it, and I came up with this one, which I think is pretty good as far as covering all of the bases. The intentional integration of trees, shrubs, perennial crops, annual crops, and sometimes livestock into a cohesive agricultural system. So if you forget all of this on this slide and what I'm talking about, just remember that it's agriculture that involves trees, and that can be done in all kinds of ways in just about any location. Some plants are and some plants aren't affected by the jungle. Yeah. So the juglone is an interesting issue because it's like it could be site dependent. because sometimes one particular site it affects a plant and another site it doesn't. But we still don't know a lot about those interactions. And actually, the plant interactions are a big part of agroforestry research, so I'm glad you bring that up. Yeah, sure. So another way to characterize agroforestry is by the 4 I's, and the 4 I's are written right here. Is the system intentional? Is it interactive? Is it integrated? And is it intensive? So if you see trees on a farm, it's not necessarily agroforestry. You can run it through this filter and say, well, ask yourself, does it meet the 4 I criteria? What's going on here in this system? Were these trees intentionally planted here to be productive? Are they interacting? Has the interaction with other plants and livestock been looked at? Is there an integrated system that the farmer is trying to put together here? And is there a level of management? Is the management intensive enough? For example, in a silvopasture system of livestock, you have to have intensive rotational grazing. So that's a good test to put any kind of system through.
So when, like people have put in trees to block the wind, for soil erosion, to stop the soil erosion, does that meet your agroforestry definition?
Yeah, actually, we're going to talk about windbreaks. Yeah, just in just a moment. That does fit. And just really quickly, why would we want to have an agroforestry system? Well, tremendous environmental benefit compared to monoculture, industrial agriculture. This infographic does a good job of just kind of basically telling you what those are. Sequesters carbon with trees, prevents soil runoff and stormwater runoff and erosion. Super important. Provides habitat, pollinator habitat, shade, microclimates. It can cool off creeks. Oftentimes we have creeks where the water gets too warm and turbid, and fish cannot survive in the creeks. Trees are great for that. And there are cases, there's research coming out to show that it actually can increase the crop yield in those alleys, for example, like the corn example earlier, or forage for livestock. Forage will do better, especially shade-loving, cool season forage will do better under trees. And you can actually get increased yields of meat and milk from animals, increased crop yields from annual crops. And there's also an animal welfare aspect to it as well. Animals grazing under trees are happier animals than being in full sun. We just did an EPA project where we planted a lot of trees, and we justified the project as meeting goals put out by the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. So this infographic just briefly demonstrates how trees absolutely help with mitigating some pollution, preventing stormwater runoff, preventing nutrient runoff from farms, and how you plant them, that can be a big part of that. Stream buffers are oftentimes used on farms to prevent nutrients from flowing into the creek, coming off from things like manure and fertilizer applications, super important. And of course, improving visual character, that's an important one as well. That can really do a lot for just landowners' feeling of ownership and pride in their own property. And that's something that doesn't get talked about enough as well. So, you brought up windbreaks. There are actually 6 types of agroforestry practices. There are 5 that we could say are canonical, and a 6th kind that was more recently added to this list. And it's not everyone fully accepts the 6th one, but we do. We think it's important, especially for urban areas. So I'll briefly just go through these. I'll start with the windbreak since you brought it up here in the top right. So this is probably the form of agroforestry that's had the most research put into it for decades and decades, going back to the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. After we learned that you have to have good soil management practices on farms or you lose the topsoil. It blows away, it washes off in rainstorms. And this is in the 20s and 30s was right when industrial agricultural practices were starting. So we learned that the hard way. There's been a lot of research put into windbreaks and how different configurations and species, et cetera, and how that will help prevent soil erosion. Jumping over here to the left top corner, alley cropping and intercropping. And this is the corn walnut slide that I showed earlier. That would be an example of alley cropping. And it's essentially any kind of alternating woody plants with anything else, essentially. There's almost a limitless number of configurations you can do this in. You can do trees, shrubs, forage, trees, shrubs, perennials, shrubs, trees. It's something that's, I would say, in practice, done a lot with trees and annual crops like we saw with the corn. It's also being experimented. There are experiments going on with wheat, and it's showing to be pretty successful insofar as some of the production actually goes up in some cases. Then you have cooling effect of the trees and actually increase the production of some of these crops. And yes, the crops and the trees will interact negatively sometimes, but that just depends on how you optimize the system. Sometimes you can put barriers down in between them so the roots don't interfere with each other. Sometimes it's just about species selection. The research is ongoing and the body of research is growing.
With the intercropping, are there certain trees? I mean, I was surprised with black walnut because of the toxins and black walnut usually and kills everything around it.
Yeah.
Are there some that are really very good together?
Believe it or not, black walnut is one of the most common ones. And you think it's counterintuitive because of the juglone, right? The big part of that is because it's such a high value timber crop that you can get from walnut. Very, very valuable, the wood that comes from the timber that comes from black walnut. You could have like a fully grown tree worth, if it's properly pruned and taken care of, $10,000. Now imagine that on acres and acres and acres. So that black walnut is chosen very often for that reason. But I would say, as far as other species of trees, timber trees are very often taken into consideration because of the high value and return you get eventually. But with a tree like black walnut, you can also get a short-term crop of nuts. And that requires like a whole nother level of like equipment and whatnot to harvest those nuts and crack them open and make them marketable. But people are experimenting with that, I think, on a smaller scale. You can, in the South, I think there's agroforestry of pine trees. And the pine straw is collected, actually, it uses mulch or pine bark mulch that is derived from the bark of the tree. So you can think a lot of products like that can come from this. But yeah, like the juglone, that's always been pretty interesting because I think a lot of it depends on the site and the species. Down here on the lower left, we've got forest farming, and this is actually a form of agroforestry has continued sort of secretly. What I mean by that is, in this image, we're looking at American ginseng, which is being cultivated in Pennsylvania. So in Appalachia, a lot of people actually still practice this form of forest farming, specifically growing American ginseng. It's a very valuable cash crop, and nobody will ever tell you about it. They don't want you to know where their ginseng is because it is subject to theft. Very often, people will come in the middle of the night and pull your entire ginseng crop out, and it's, could be tens of thousands of dollars worth of ginseng. But this is a good example of forest farming, which is basically just cultivating, usually I would say perennial crops on the forest floor, and they are usually medicinal in nature, not necessarily food producing. Although you can also grow shiitake mushrooms in forest farming, people are doing that. So agroforestry does also involve fungi on occasion. So over here, we got silvopasture, and this is, you can see in the image here, we've got cattle in the woods, and this is kind of the classic image of silvopasture, I think, that comes to mind for a lot of people. Livestock absolutely can be integrated into an agroforestry system. And I want to mention earlier some of the benefits for animal welfare and for production that can come from this. The important thing to remember is that you have to go back to those 4 eyes and really evaluate a system like this and to really determine whether it's, I would say, real agroforestry, real in quotes. Just if you're a forest owner and you allow your animals to just go wander around in the woods, that's not necessarily agroforestry, because those animals eventually over time will actually harm the trees, they'll trample the roots. And so this has to be done in a very prescribed and highly managed way with rotational grazing, with fencing within the forest. That I would say is agroforestry. Additionally, you should really be getting more than one product from the system. So, for example, you can do silvopasture with cattle and maybe sugar maples and get maple syrup from the trees. As long as you're doing it in that highly managed, prescribed way, you're preventing the animals from trampling the trees, and you're doing the rotational grazing. I would call that a silvopasture system. And finally, riparian buffers down here on the lower right. I mentioned this earlier briefly. This is actually a form of agroforestry, I guess you could say, is that has a funded program associated with it currently, kind of sort of the Conservation Reserve Program, CRP, which is a federal program that gives farmers money to actually take some of their land out of production around streams and plant it with trees to prevent nutrients from flowing into the creek. So it's a water quality protection measure. As of right now, the farmers are not really supposed to be getting any kind of product or harvest from these trees. I think that goes against the program's rules. But in the future, I could see maybe USDA coming around and allowing some actual agroforestry practices to be done in these riparian buffers, like, for example, planting fruit trees or pawpaw trees or native fruit trees, getting some income from those trees, but also preserving the water quality. So those are the 5 canonical practices. In the middle here is the one that we're dealing with, and that we've basically, our program is centered around, and that is the food forest. And I mentioned earlier that this is a more recent addition to the canon, and not everyone agrees that this is a form of agroforestry. We strongly feel that it is, because this is the best kind for urban areas. It's essentially just planting fruit and nut-bearing trees in almost any configuration that you want, but I would say informed by the local ecology and local environmental conditions. So this is an example, this photo here in the middle, of a food forest that we planted in Fulton, and it's doing quite well. It's at Van Buren Park, I believe. If you ever want to go see it, there are pawpaw trees there. We also planted trees along the shoreline of the lake in Fulton. And we've done tree plantings in Oswego too, by the way, in the past, but those projects were not necessarily agroforestry centered. They were more stormwater mitigation oriented. So lately, the work that we've been doing with our agroforestry program has been centered on food forests, the urban food forests primarily. And one more thing about all of this typology here. These configurations will basically, they sort of mimic the ecology and the local ecology in a way, where they mimic sort of forest ecology or savanna ecology. And that's essentially the foundation of agroforestry practice, is that with the trees, with the shrubs, with the perennials, you are approximating an ecosystem in a way that an industrial monoculture cannot do, or doesn't even come close to doing. So summing it all up, we can say that urban agroforestry checks the boxes, if you remember from our previous discussion on wellness.
I fell asleep.
we had that list of factors that go into wellness. Provides nearby nature, improves the environment, and gives us food and medicine. And this image right here is a service berry from actually a park that's only 2 blocks away from my house. And these are service berries that I collected in a basket, very prolific. One of my favorite species for agroforestry. The berries are kind of like blueberries and a lot easier to grow. And just, you know, hold on a second. Oh, oh, no. Thanks. And just, you know, reiterating, how does agroforestry check all the boxes for wellness? Provides green space for stress relief. It provides us with food and medicine. It actually has a lot of environmental benefit, especially in our urban environments where we need it so much for air and water quality. Reduces the urban heat island in the summer. Creates urban habitat. I think this one is important. Promotes social interaction. So not only creating spaces that invite people in to have and to enjoy them and interact with each other, but also like the creation of the space itself, having tree planting events, having programming associated with that space is all social interaction that contributes to wellness. Community beautification, raising property values for sure, if that's something that, you know, a lot of people are concerned about that in the inner city. Psychological and spiritual connection. And when I say spiritual, I mean that in a broad sense, you know, going into a space, a natural space and experiencing awe and the beauty of the space. And of course, building a sense of place. In a lot of the neighborhoods where we work, there are a lot of vacant lots, and most of our projects are on vacant lots, actually. These are neighborhoods in Syracuse that are very, that have been blighted. They've experienced disinvestment. So we actually, the agroforestry idea, going back to my initial conversation about the rain gardens, we started building these rain gardens on the vacant lots, and we thought, well, how else can we enhance the public benefit? There's a lot of other space on this rain garden. So why don't we plant some trees and invite the community in to enjoy the space, almost creating like a little pocket park. So I think that's really important for this, as far as this final bullet is concerned, building a sense of place in communities that really could use it. And agroforestry checks all these boxes. Specifically, the food forests, the urban agroforestry that we're talking about. So I'd like to now switch gears and talk a little bit about some of the projects that we've done in Syracuse. We have a few examples here. It's going to be kind of more of a show and tell format, but we have a lot of successful examples in Syracuse that I think a lot of people don't know about. And we're trying to spread the word about what can be done in the community, what kinds of projects can be done, working with some great partners who are motivated to do this. So this is the Rama Edible Snack Garden. It is actually the oldest, I believe the oldest food forest in Syracuse. It's over 10 years old, I believe. And it's associated, going back to this idea of agroforestry and nearby nature being a treatment of sorts, being sort of a preventative medicine. It's actually associated with a health clinic, with the Rama Health Clinic. And down here in the lower left, you can see some of the doctors and medical professionals holding apples that were harvested from the garden. The folks here will actually prescribe nature time to some of their patients. They'll say, go outside and walk around in the garden, you know, pick some apples, take them home with you, you know, lower your blood pressure a little bit. So they recognize that, and we're happy about that. And it's been a community project that's been going on for quite some time with lots of partners. People have cleanups there, and we actually supplied quite a few of the trees back in the day. Over here on this image on the right is mulberry that is growing there. I think this is the native one, actually, the red mulberry. So this is a great example. if you're ever in Syracuse, and you have some extra time to kill, check out the Rama Edible Snack Garden. This is another one that this is actually our oldest project. This is the 701 Oswego Street Garden and Food Forest. We initially, this was a green infrastructure project. This actually has a bioswale that takes stormwater off of the street and it goes into the bioswale. And this is one of those vacant lot projects that we thought, well, how can we enhance this? What can we add to it? So I think this one is also over 10 years old. We planted peach and apple trees. This is more of a conventional orchard style. We also, I think, have some raspberries and elderberries there. And this is when it was first planted on the left here. And this is a more recent image. It's very productive. I've gone there and I've seen community members from nearby homes picking apples and peaches, which is great. There's been a lot of community investment in this site as well. It's right next to a park. This is the Kwanzaa Community Garden, and this is a much more recent project. This is this was originally just if you look at the map here, this middle light area, it was just a community garden with raised beds. And more recently, the Southside TNT, Tomorrow's Neighborhoods Today, this is a civic organization in Syracuse, decided they wanted to have a food forest. So working with us and also working with the Syracuse Urban Food Forest Project, SUFP, which is actually a collaborative between SUNY ESF and Syracuse University. We installed this wonderful food forest with trees and shrubs, food producing trees and shrubs. And this was actually just planted last year. So it went from this little community garden to a huge food forest. And we're excited about this project because it really enhanced this program a lot. And by the way, this was a project that was, we provided the shrubs under our EPA EJ grant that we had last year for agroforestry.
With the shrubs. Shrubs.
Yeah, actually Dylan personally planted a lot of them.
They're all medicinal or food producing.
Did you guys plant elderberry there?
Yeah.
This is actually one of our rain garden sites that we own. Another recent project, also under the EPA funded EJ grant from last year. This planting you see in the image was just done in November. So if you look at the plan, the design here on the left, you can see this white box, and that's the rain garden. Also taking water off of the street, goes into a drain here, into a pipe, into the garden. It infiltrates into the ground. I keep forgetting to check the actual numbers for this garden, but they can uptake a surprisingly high amount of water, like possibly tens of thousands or even up to 100,000 gallons per.
Hundreds of thousands.
Hundreds of, yeah, this one, yeah. So this little, yeah, I mean, we have this rain garden on a vacant lot, but we decided, well, how can we enhance this site and make it more of a community social benefit? So we had this rain garden put in, we had this food forest put in on our EJ grant.
Did you have concerns, you hear about a lot of flood in certain areas, and you touch soils, and you can have working in the ocean.
So the lead, that's a good question. The lead in the soils is really mostly an issue if you are working in the soil, you get it on your hands and you like ingest it somehow. Like little kid, that's a risky, that can happen if they don't wash their hands. The plants themselves are not super efficient at uptaking the lead. So I would say it's really mostly a hazard if you've been working in the soil and you don't wash your hands, or you have kids who've been working and they haven't washed their hands. And this is a site that we also recently did a infiltration test with Onondaga Earth Corps. If you're not familiar with Onondaga Earth Corps, they're a youth training program in Syracuse. They're at this point like the go-to green infrastructure maintenance group crew, and it's been a really successful program. Mostly inner city youth that get trained to work on sites like this, and we just train them how to do an infiltration test. And we also did a little review of the agroforestry with them as well. So just looking at some of the species that we will commonly encounter, I wanted to just go over that briefly. Also, not just the native species, but the non-native as well. And I made a point to put this into the presentation because we generally only work with native species, and that's mostly related to the grants that we get. There's a stipulation that they have to be native from Forest Service and from EPA. But you will find a lot of research projects being done at the University of Missouri, for example, involving Chinese chestnut, English walnut, European hazelnut, which are all fine for agroforestry as well. I would say as long as they're not invasive, you can have non-natives. You can have conventional orchard species like apple, pear, and peach in an agroforestry system. There's nothing wrong with that. I have white mulberry up here. That is actually invasive, but what I find is that tree volunteers in a lot of places. Like I actually have one in my yard, and it produces a lot of berries, and I let it grow. Like I'm not going to cut it down. I would recommend planting white mulberry. We actually have a native red mulberry. And if you're going to do mulberry, definitely plant the native one. But if you have a white mulberry in a garden or in a food forest and it's producing, there's nothing wrong with just leaving it. So you can think more broadly about types of species that we have in this agroforestry system. Regarding the native species, this list here on the left is probably a list of some of the most common you'll encounter. Black walnut, we already talked about that, super common. Although I personally probably wouldn't plant as many of those because of the fact that the nuts are just so incredibly hard to crack open. I mean, you really have to have like a device to do it for you.
Right.
Or a hammer, yeah. Or a car. Some people drive over them. I actually much prefer hickories. We have perfectly suitable species, shagbark hickory here, native to central New York and the Northeast, which I think is great for, much easier to crack open. But yeah, these are all species that you will commonly encounter. Oh yeah, I don't have any cherries up there. Black cherry is one that we plant a lot, and those are a little bit tough because they get so high. And you have to kind of process them a little bit. They're kind of bitter. But choke cherry, Prunus virginiana, that's another good one. I've made jam out of that. It was delicious. But a lot of these native cherries, you do have to kind of cook because otherwise they're kind of bitter if you eat them raw. Elderberry, pawpaw. Do you guys know what pawpaw? Heard of pawpaw? Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. Oh, we just saw those. Yeah. Serviceberry I mentioned earlier. Here's some serviceberries. And on this plate, by the way, there are white mulberries mixed in with black raspberries, which can be very weedy, but it's a native, great, very prolific, great agroforestry kind of like restoration species is black raspberry, and some gooseberries. American hazelnut, that's one we've planted a lot of. I also have some as well. The nuts that come from them, if you can actually get to them before the squirrels do, they will absolutely, you have no chance. If you do actually happen to get one, it's like sometimes there's a nut there, sometimes it's just like a shriveled up little thing. So
I'm surprised you get service berry. Every service berry tree I've ever known.
Oh yeah. In the park near my house, there's so many of them. I just I have to beat them to it. But I think they get overwhelmed with how many there are. So there's always a little bit left over for you. American persimmon, we plant a lot of that as well. I have two. They have yet to produce, and I think they're dioecious with male and female plants separate.
Are they small bushes?
American persimmon, they're trees.
They're trees.
Yeah, yeah. Pawpaws are also, they're trees as well. They're understory trees, but they grow differently depending on the light conditions. So you can plant them in like on the understory under other trees, and they will kind of get like leggy. You can also plant them in full sun, and they develop this interesting kind of conical habit. Both pretty productive. So we could talk about species for days. We're gonna actually profile two specific ones that we really like and that are important in our program. We just talked about pawpaws. So here's an image of, this was only a fraction of last year's pawpaw harvest from just a few trees that we have in front of our office. Once they start producing, they're very productive. Has anyone here ever tried a pawpaw? Tried a pawpaw? And I figured maybe this fall, if you'll have a chance, now that you know where some of these foraging sites are, you can go find some. It's been characterized as banana meets mango. It's really delicious. I think the more ripe it is, the more like brown and ripe it is, the more delicious it is. Harvested in the fall, usually September. It's related to tropical fruits, and I think it's the Asamina triloba is the northernmost species member of this family. And it's native, so it's technically not native to central New York, but it's almost native. That's the term we use, almost native. It basically goes up to like kind of extreme southwestern New York. It's found primarily like in the Ohio Valley and the Mississippi basin. But a lot of these plants, like pawpaw and I'm trying to think of another one, pecan, that's another one. We actually do plant pecans. They're not technically native to New York, but these species are kind of like slowly moving their way up into the Northeast as we rebound from the previous ice age. So they're going to be native at some point. Additionally, we're thinking about planting things that are, when we think about resilience in the face of climate change, planting things that might be a little bit more, from the south, southerly in their nativity native range. So planting things like oaks and pawpaws, and we saw some earlier at the Arboretum, like Carolina silverbell. So it's not, I guess my point is, they might not technically be native to New York, but their range is pretty close to New York. It's not like planting something from another continent. And we were permitted to plant these under our grants, our USDA grants and our EPA grants. They had no problem with pawpaws. The second species we would like to profile is elderberry. This is one that has probably had the most success kind of coming into public awareness as far as its medicinal properties. A lot of people who are not into plants or forestry or gardening probably know what elderberry is, because there have been a lot of products on the market recently, like some of these elderberry lozenges we have up front, elderberry gummies, elderberry syrup. You can get a lot of this stuff in health food stores now or on Amazon. And a lot of it comes from the fact that there is evidence showing that elderberry can help prevent, treat cold and flu. There is no evidence to support it doing the same for COVID, but I don't know if anyone's actually looked at it. It's very prolific. It has a naturally sweet flavor. When I make elderberry tea, I just boil water with some elderberries. I don't add sugar or honey to it. I think it's actually sweet enough just with the berries. And it's very easily dried or frozen, which is important. Storing the fruit long term is an important factor. And yeah, I've actually dried them in a dehydrator. They dry out super easy. And I've just cut off entire heads of berries and frozen them.
How much space does it require before you would have enough product to make it worth keeping from?
I would say it produces pretty early. Even just a few canes can start producing a few heads. And even if like you got just one head, they're pretty big. Like you can have maybe like if you dry them out, you can have like a jar of dried berries just from that one head, or just throw it in the freezer. So yeah, I think they're definitely worth planting everywhere we go. Interesting fact about this, the taxonomy, Sambucus canadensis, I believe I read somewhere recently that, so there's a native elderberry, which is the canadensis, and there's a European one, Sambucus nigra. I think they're actually now starting to realize that they're the same species, but and the kinds that we find on the different continents are basically subspecies of the same species. That being said, it's still important when you're doing like restoration or almost any tree planting project. If you're focusing on native species, if that's one of the goals, you do want to plant what is genetically local and native. So if that was an important goal, I would definitely want to plant the canadensis, even if, you know, they're now considered the same species as the European one. So the fun topic, foraging. This is something that when we're talking about the programming that you can design around a food forest. Foraging expeditions and excursions are one of them. A lot of fun. In the image here, you can see some students from Syracuse University and SUNY ESF a few years ago as part of the SUFP program that I mentioned earlier. This was the Urban Food Forest Project, the collaborative between the two schools. I think basically it's like 3 professors came together with some interested students and put this together. And they actually been really successful. They applied for a GLRI grant and got it a couple of years ago. And they planted a ton of food producing trees all along Onondaga Creek through the middle of the city. But they did, I don't know if they do this anymore, but they did these foraging walks. And you can see here that they're doing this in winter. So foraging, it doesn't necessarily have to be just something you do during harvest or spring and summer or fall. And down here, they've got looks like maybe some like spruce needle tea or balsam fir tea or something like that. Most evergreens that you encounter, you can actually make tea out of the needles, and it's a good source of vitamin C. But on the topic of foraging, there are a lot of wild species you can pretty much encounter walking into like a cemetery, across campus, into almost any green space in the city. You'll come across these. Wild grape grows everywhere. It's, you know, essentially a weed, but you can make really good grape juice out of it. Black raspberry, I mentioned earlier, super prolific. I've walked away with like pint jars full of black raspberries just from weedy, you know, scrubby looking areas that you wouldn't think twice walking by. Hickories, acorns, and black walnuts, we talked about those. Acorns, yes, you can actually eat acorns. I'm sure you know that. You just have to process them properly. Some species have a lot more tannins than others. The red oaks have a lot more tannins versus the white oaks and the bur oaks, which have less, and you can probably choose those as the better option for eating. The way that you remove the tannins is that you can soak them or boil them. The cherries, there's the cherries. Someone mentioned cherries earlier. Black and choke cherries are probably the most common that you will encounter, both native, but again, probably require a little bit of processing because they're both a little bit bitter if you eat them raw. Not native, but there are tons of what I call wild apple trees growing everywhere around Syracuse. In the fall, I just like to drive around the countryside and look for roadside apples. And a lot of them are heirlooms that have been forgotten about that are just growing. Ramps, also known as wild leek. This is actually a species that is somewhat slightly declining because they're actually being over harvested. There are a lot of people who are very enthusiastic about ramps. Serviceberry, we talked about, excellent foraging species. Butternut, you'll still find some butternut trees in parks. There is a butternut canker disease, unfortunately, that's wiping a lot of them out. It's actually in the same genus as black walnut. Butternut is supposed to be very delicious. I've never tried it. But the sad fact is a lot of them, if not all of them at some point, most of them are going to be wiped out by butternut canker. Although you do come across some in, like I said, in parks. After digging on that topic a little bit, it turns out a lot of these wild butternuts are actually natural results of crossing with Japanese walnut from possibly a long time ago when there were a lot of farmsteads. And these hybrids are just kind of scattered throughout the landscape. There has been some research into preserving this species. Unfortunately, not a lot has been found as far as finding natural resistance in the wild. I think the scientific community has come to the conclusion that the best way to preserve it is to cross it with Japanese walnut over and over again until they come up with a hybrid that has most of the traits of black walnut, but also has resistance to the kangaroo. We still do plant butternuts, by the way. We feel that we include them, not a lot of them, we include them in our projects. Because you never know, you might get the one that has the resistance gene at some point. So we think it's still worth it to keep planting them and keep them in the landscape. And I mentioned evergreens. You can get vitamin C, you can make tea out of evergreens. Pretty much all of them. They tend to have different flavors. Yeah, you can make gin. Yeah, juniper berries. Yeah. The one I would avoid. Well, yeah. There's a YEW, Taxus. I don't think you should make tea from that. And they have these red berries that are really kind of slimy, and they're edible, but the seed is not. So the seed is actually really toxic. So you're fine as long as you don't spit the seed out. I would never ever like tell a kid that this is edible, and as long as you spit the seed out. It's a more
about American chestnut or the ESF new variety of chestnut.
Oh, is there a new variety?
I think they have done some modification
Yeah,
to make it resistant
yeah.
to
Transgenic, maybe. Yeah.
Have you done it?
No, we actually haven't. But if they're coming up with some new resistant varieties, that might be worth taking a look at. Yeah.
Well, we were doing transgenic.
Yes, well, like,
We were talking to one of our partners for our recent EJ project was the Onondaga Nation, and they said that one of the sister nations in the Haudenosaunee, I think the Seneca, has a fully grown American chestnut that doesn't appear to be succumbing to, so there could still be some resistant ones out there. So foraging is, this is programming you can do with a food forest, with students, with kids, with just about anyone. And on the topic of involving kids and youth, there is this website called fallingfruit.org. You may have heard of it. I think this would actually be a really fun activity with youth because it's got this kind of like scavenger hunt Pokemon concept to it. And basically you find a forageable species anywhere that has it's basically like Google Maps. And this is actually an example, I think, from Syracuse, Onondaga Creek. You find it and you can log it into you geolocate it, and anyone else who looks at the map will see what you put in there. Oh, there's a pawpaw here. Oh, there's a black cherry here. So I can go forage it. It makes foraging easier and more fun. And the downside is that maybe if it catches on too much, those food forests will get decimated by people. There's kind of a balance. So what that means, we got to plant more food forests. And how do we use urban agroforestry products? This is a question that comes up sometimes. What can I actually do with these products? I think first and foremost, the best way to use them is just fresh and seasonally. If you're into seasonal eating, this is a great way to kind of expand what you can consume. Freezing them is another option. I freeze service berries. I freeze elderberries, for example. You can put harvested nuts in the freezer. That's probably the easiest, most go-to way of preserving these products for most people. You can dry them. Dehydrators help with that, but you can use your oven if you don't have a dehydrator. Making jams, jellies, and preserves. This is a great way to do it with some of the high acid fruits. The only thing is that it has a lot of sugar in it, and not everyone wants to eat a lot of sugar. But you actually can stuff without sugar. It's a little known fact. You do not need sugar to can. The sugar, what it does is it keeps the consistency more thick. If you don't use sugar, it kind of becomes out watery.
We have, it's 150-year-old, two jars that George Washington had preserved cherries in a jar in clay in their basement.
Really?
Yeah, they just resurrected it. They said the cherries were perfectly good,
Really?
but it was a way that they preserved things.
Was it done with like with wax or something, or did they?
They just put the cherries in the jar and then they buried the jars in clay. The basement.
Oh wow! I'll look that up.
Yeah, who tried it?
Nobody's tried.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
They
you
look good.
mentioned the need for sugar or the problem with sugar.
Mhm.
That's clearly one of the issues with rhubarb. But it is, to what extent does that work as a participant in these forest environments that you create?
The rhubarb, using rhubarb, that could certainly be an agroforestry plant, yeah. In a permaculture setup or just a garden where you've got a mixture of different species. But yeah, you're right. It's kind of hard to eat that without something sweet, right? I would say like maybe you could experiment with just adding a lot of sweet fruits to it, and maybe using a little bit less rhubarb, more fruit, just different ratio. Yeah, using more strawberries, maybe adding some pawpaw. Pawpaw rhubarb actually sounds kind of good because it's really sweet.
You could use, you could, proper apple might make it.
Yeah. Definitely, yeah.
Is this applesauce that you make?
So
Or
this,
huge?
that's Canoochie, yeah. So this is actually hickory milk. This is not my photo. I've never made it. I've never tried it. But from what I've read, it's very delicious. Superior to any kind of store-bought nut milk like almond milk or hemp milk or anything. This is actually how this has been done for hundreds of years by the Native Americans, including the Haudenosaunee, would make Canoochie out of hickories. And it's basically you just grind them up and boil them, and then you kind of strain it out, and you get this hickory milk. Yeah. And I actually would like to try it. I might try it this fall. Hopefully we'll get a good hickory crop like we did last year. Fruit leathers, you can do that too. If you have a dehydrator, you can make something like pemmican, which is like colonial era sort of like survival food out of, I think they actually use the choke cherries a lot for that, the native cherries. And they would combine it with, I think, like jerky and make this sort of like cherry jerky combination that would just last for a long time. So yeah, and of course there's canning. A lot of different ways to preserve these products. And I would say when in doubt, just do it fresh and seasonal or throw it in the freezer. If you have no other means to preserve them, just put them in the freezer. A lot of them just last a long time in the freezer, no problem. All right, so here's what a pawpaw looks like, by the way, sliced open. This is from one of our trees a few years ago. And we do have an announcement to make now that we've pretty much finished the presentation. Our announcement is related to agroforestry and something that we're going to be doing here at SUNY Oswego. So we just found out we got a GLRI grant. We just found this out last week, actually. And we are working with SUNY Oswego and Rice Creek Field Station to do a big tree planting, agroforestry themed tree planting here on campus. And this is actually just a portion of that planting. There's a lot more. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. And it also involves planting trees at St. Luke's assisted living facility. So it's going to be over at least 400 trees, and I think 250 of them are going to be here on campus. So yeah. And when the time comes, planting time, we're definitely going to be soliciting volunteers and students to help us with that, and take ownership of the food forest that you'll have here. So stay tuned for that. Yeah, we're very excited about it. Those are proposed trees.
Those are trees.
Yeah. So,
Great.
yeah, we're super excited and can't wait to start on that. I think the planting will probably happen in fall of next year. And before that, we'll do the planning, all the planning part of it. I'll end here with this image, these two images. This was a recent project that we also are done with, but this was a great community project in Wayne County in the Walcott Butler area. And we did a small food forest. We planted a small food forest on town property, and we basically created a little pocket park for this community. And we also planted a native species pollinator garden right here, and we got this pavilion and a lot of picnic tables and a dock and all this stuff that you for the use of their pond, which you can see back here. But this was also a successful project from a community advocacy point of view because it resulted in the creation of a Friends of Butler Mill Pond group. And we had, by the end of the project, we had a group of enthusiastic citizens come together that helped us plant all the trees and the pollinator garden, and they took ownership of this site after we were done. So I just wanted to end on that note, especially as we're thinking now about this big tree planting we're going to have here on campus, and we're talking about taking ownership, and hopefully the students and the community members here will take ownership of it and keep the trees alive and cherish them. So on that topic, we have any comments or discussion items or any questions about anything?
You don't mention pears very much. They seem to be a really productive and delicious
Yeah,
item to include with other.
we actually, I guess there are some Bartlett pears here on campus, right? We just saw some of those earlier today. But yeah, that's a great example of that could be done in a garden, orchard, agroforestry setup. Yeah. I actually have a pear tree. It hasn't produced fruit yet, but it is surviving. Any other questions about any of the tree species we talked about?